The air in the Senate Judiciary Committee room was thick with the stale scent of old paper and ambition. A silence so profound you could hear a pin drop. Then a fist slammed down on the polished wood, a sound like a gavel of pure fury. Adam Schiff, his face a mask of crimson rage, leaned forward, his voice a low snarl that coiled through the chamber. "You are a disgrace," he spat, the words aimed like daggers at Senator John Kennedy, a cheap fraud in a rumpled suit, selling snake oil to the gullible. The gallery, packed with Schiff's supporters, erupted in a roar of approval. Kennedy, seemingly unfazed, sat with a stillness that was almost unnerving. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his lips as he slowly, deliberately, reached into his jacket. The morning had started with the monotonous drone of FBI oversight testimony, a procedural waltz designed to bore even the most ardent C-SPAN viewer. Kennedy had been methodically questioning officials, his Louisiana drawl a soft counterpoint to the room's marble severity. He spoke of constitutional guardrails and the dangers of unchecked power, his questions precise and academic. Then Schiff had detonated. The California Democrat, a man who had built a career on the national stage as a prosecutor of presidents, was now a volcano of indignation. "You sit there," Schiff's voice climbed, his finger jabbing the air. "Lecturing us on integrity? You, who championed a carnival barker, a traitor who sold this country to our enemies?" The Democratic side of the gallery was a sea of nodding heads and shouted encouragements. "Give it to him, Adam," a voice cried out, the sound echoing off the vaulted ceilings. The room, a space consecrated to sober debate, had been twisted into a partisan battlefield. Reporters, smelling blood in the water, typed with a furious intensity, their faces illuminated by the glow of their laptops. This was the story. Not the bureaucratic minutiae of FBI procedure, but this raw, ugly, personal war. In the front row, a woman named Maria Gonzalez clutched a small laminated photograph of her son, his marine dress blues crisp and proud. She had driven from a small town outside Baton Rouge, a letter from Senator Kennedy's office tucked into her purse. She had come seeking answers, not to witness a public immolation. On the dais, Kennedy's Republican colleagues shifted in their leather chairs, their discomfort palpable. This was not the usual political theater. This was a breach of the Senate's most sacred, unwritten rules. It was a declaration of total war. Kennedy, meanwhile, had retrieved a simple handkerchief. He removed his wire-rimmed glasses, which had caught a fine mist of spittle from Schiff's tirade, and began to clean them. The movements were slow, methodical, each circular wipe a small act of defiance against the chaos erupting around him. His hands, weathered from a life lived far from the Beltway's polished corridors, were as steady as a surgeon's. He held the glasses up to the light, inspected them, and then, with the same unhurried grace, placed them back on his nose. He looked at Schiff, his eyes clear and calm, holding a gaze that seemed to penetrate the other man's fury. "Are you done, Senator?" Kennedy's voice was soft, almost a whisper, yet it cut through the noise like a razor. The gentleness of the question was more disarming than any shout could have been. Schiff, caught off guard by the lack of a counterattack, faltered for a microsecond. "Done?" he roared, recovering his momentum. "I am just getting started with you, you pathetic charlatan." Kennedy simply nodded, his placid smile never wavering. "That is a pity," he said, his voice still quiet, "because I was hoping to ask you a question." A hush began to fall over the room. The shift in power was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It was the sudden stillness of a predator that has finally locked onto its prey. Kennedy's hand moved across the table, coming to rest on a thick, unassuming binder. The binder was plain, with no bold markings, yet Schiff's eyes were drawn to it, as if by a magnetic force. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "You told the world," Kennedy began, his voice gaining a new resonance, a quiet authority that commanded attention, that you possessed undeniable proof. You looked into the cameras day after day, week after week, and you swore you had seen evidence of the highest crime a president can commit. He paused, letting the weight of his words fill the sudden, oppressive silence. Evidence that would shake the foundations of our republic. He leaned forward, his eyes locking with Schiff's. My question, Senator, is a simple one. The room held its breath. Where is it? Schiff's mouth opened and closed, a fish gasping for air. That is classified, he stammered, his voice losing its thunderous certainty. I cannot discuss sensitive intelligence matters. Kennedy's smile widened, but it was no longer gentle. It was sharp, predatory. Cannot, Senator? He interrupted, the word hanging in the air. Or would not? He tapped the binder with a single finger. Or, perhaps, never could. The foundation of Adam Schiff's world had just begun to crack, and the sound was deafening. The silence that descended upon the committee room was a heavy, suffocating blanket. The boisterous energy that had fueled Schiff's supporters just moments before seemed to evaporate, replaced by a tense, uncertain stillness. Even the frantic clatter of keyboards from the press section slowed, as every eye fixed on the two men locked in a silent battle of wills. Chairman Lindsey Graham, who had looked moments away from slamming his gavel down during Schiff's outburst, now leaned back in his chair, his expression one of grim fascination. He was letting the scene play out. Schiff, for his part, struggled to regain his footing on the shifting ground. This is a pathetic attempt at intimidation, he declared, his voice loud but brittle, lacking the iron conviction it held before. A desperate diversion from the real issues. I stood up to a corrupt president. I did my duty under the Constitution. Kennedy offered no reply. Instead, he opened the plain binder with a quiet, deliberate motion. The soft rustle of paper was an acoustic shock in the silent room. He arranged several documents in a neat row before him, each one placed with the precision of a chess master, setting the board for a final, decisive game. The air crackled with anticipation. The evidence, Schiff insisted, his gaze sweeping the gallery as if searching for the allies who had been so vocal just minutes ago. The evidence was overwhelming. Russia attacked our democracy. A few scattered claps came from the Democratic side, but they were hesitant, dying out almost as soon as they began. Let us talk about evidence, Kennedy said, his voice as smooth and cool as the marble columns that lined the room. He looked up from his papers, his gaze sweeping over Schiff, the committee, and the gallery. Since you have questioned my intelligence, Senator, perhaps you will permit me a moment to clarify some facts for my own understanding, and for the American people watching at home, who for 3 years were told a story that now appears to have been a work of fiction. He reached under the table and produced a thick, blue-bound report, its cover instantly recognizable to everyone in the room. He held it up, not with a flourish, but with a somber gravity. The Durham Report, all 478 pages of it. Let's begin our education, shall we? Kennedy said, opening the report to a page marked with a yellow tab. Let's review what Special Counsel John Durham, after years of investigation and access to our nation's most sensitive intelligence, actually discovered about your claims. The color began to drain from Schiff's face, a slow, creeping pallor that made his skin look like parchment under the harsh fluorescent lights. Shall we start? Kennedy continued, his voice a lethal combination of Southern politeness and prosecutorial steel, with the lies you told the American people. In the gallery, Maria Gonzalez leaned forward, her knuckles white as she gripped the back of the bench in front of her. In the last row, a young Democratic aide, who had been live-tweeting Schiff's triumphant attack, quietly closed his laptop, slid it into his bag, and slipped out a side door. It was the first drop in what was about to become a flood. The low hum of a projector filled the room as the lights dimmed. A massive screen behind Kennedy flickered to life, displaying a stark, blood-red slide. In bold white letters, it read, Schiff, I have seen more than circumstantial evidence. Durham, no actual evidence of collusion existed. A collective gasp swept through the gallery. It was one thing to hear the reports discussed on cable news, filtered through partisan talking heads. It was another to see the core contradiction laid bare in giant letters in a United States Senate hearing. Kennedy rose from his chair and walked toward the screen, a laser pointer in his hand. A small, precise red dot appeared on the screen, hovering like a sniper's sight over the first entry on a timeline. March 20th, 2017, Kennedy began, his voice methodical, each word a carefully placed stone in the foundation of his argument. You appeared on NBC's Meet the Press. You looked the host, Chuck Todd, directly in the eye, and you told him, and I am quoting you directly, I can't go into the particulars, but I can say that there is more than circumstantial evidence of collusion. The screen shifted, and suddenly the room was watching a younger, more confident Adam Schiff. His hair was perfectly coiffed, his expression one of absolute, unshakable certainty. There is evidence that is not circumstantial, his recorded voice echoed in the chamber. And I've seen it. The clip ended, and the screen returned to the timeline. The red dot of the laser pointer moved to the next date. May of 2017, Kennedy narrated. You were on CNN with Jake Tapper. Another clip played. Another confident assertion. The case is being built, Schiff's video doppelganger assured the nation. The evidence is damning, and it is in the public view. The laser dot moved again. July 2017, MSNBC. This time, the clip showed Schiff holding up a document, his face grave. The Steele dossier, Kennedy's live voice explained, as his recorded self spoke of its contents. You read its salacious and unverified claims into the congressional record, giving the weight of your office to what we now know was a piece of political opposition research, funded by your own party. Point of order! Schiff shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Mr. Chairman, point of order! Chairman Graham turned his head slowly. Senator Schiff, he said, his voice laced with an authority he had not displayed earlier. You had your say. You were not interrupted. Senator Kennedy will be afforded the same courtesy. Sit down. The command was not a request. It was an order, backed by the full weight of the chairmanship. Schiff stood frozen for a moment, his jaw working silently. He looked as if he wanted to argue, to fight back, but the ground had vanished from beneath him. He sank back into his chair, his face a thunderous mask of fury and impotence. Kennedy waited for him to be seated, then continued, as if nothing had happened. October 2017. ABC's This Week. You stated, and I quote, there is clear evidence of collusion on the part of the campaign. November 2017. CBS's Face the Nation. You assured the host that the evidence was more than sufficient. January 2018. CNN again. Those are taken out of context, Schiff blurted out, his voice cracking with desperation. Kennedy stopped his presentation. He turned away from the screen and faced Schiff directly, a look of mild curiosity on his face. Out of context? He repeated, letting the words hang in the air. All of them? Yes. You are cherry-picking phrases to create a false narrative. All 37 times? Kennedy asked, his voice still soft. The number landed like a physical blow. 37. The screen behind him suddenly erupted into a dizzying, rapid-fire montage. Schiff on CNN. Schiff on MSNBC. Schiff on ABC, CBS, NBC. A whirlwind of interviews. A cacophony of confident assertions. More than circumstantial. The case is clear. Damning. Collusion occurred. The montage lasted for a full minute. A relentless audio-visual assault that condensed 3 years of public pronouncements into a single damning indictment of his own making. When it ended, the screen went black, and the silence that followed was absolute, profound, and devastating. The black screen held for a long, dramatic moment before a new slide appeared, its text stark and irrefutable. The heading read, the official findings. Below it, the conclusions of 3 separate, exhaustive investigations were laid out in chronological order. First, the Mueller report, dated March 2019. The investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities. The words, once the subject of endless debate and spin, now seemed simple, final. The slide changed. The Inspector General's report, December 2019. We identified at least 17 significant errors or omissions in the FISA applications, a performance failure that raised significant questions regarding the FBI chain of commands management and supervision of the FISA process. The screen changed again, delivering the final fatal blow. The Durham Report, May 2023. The FBI had no predicated evidence to open the Crossfire Hurricane investigation. The department and the FBI failed to uphold their important mission of strict fidelity to the law. The entire narrative that Schiff had championed for years, the foundation of his political stardom, was dismantled in 3 slides. The Democrats in the gallery, who had cheered his initial attack, were now silent. Many were staring down at their phones, the blue light illuminating faces etched with confusion and a dawning sense of betrayal. They were no longer watching a political victory. They were witnessing a public vivisection. 2 more people from the Democratic side stood up, gathering their belongings with a quiet haste, and made their way to the exits. The exodus was becoming a steady, undeniable trickle. Kennedy returned to his seat at the witness table and picked up the physical copy of the Durham report. He opened it to a bookmarked section and began to read aloud, his voice calm and measured, letting the words of the report do the work. Quote, "Neither U.S. law enforcement nor the intelligence community appears to have possessed any actual evidence of collusion in their holdings at the commencement of the Crossfire Hurricane investigation." He looked up from the page, his eyes finding Schiff's across the room. "Senator," he said, the politeness in his tone making the accusation even more damning, "as the ranking member and then chairman of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, you had access to the very same classified information that Robert Mueller reviewed. You saw the same raw intelligence that Inspector General Horowitz examined. You knew what John Durham eventually confirmed for the world." Kennedy's voice hardened, just a fraction, but enough to signal a shift from presenting facts to delivering a judgment. "And yet, for 3 years, you went on national television, 37 separate times, and you told the American people that you had personally seen evidence that these 3 independent, exhaustive investigations have now proven, beyond any shadow of a doubt, never existed." "I had a different interpretation of the intelligence," Schiff said, his voice defensive and thin. "The data was complex. It was ambiguous." "Interpretation," Kennedy interrupted, the word sharp and dismissive. "Senator, you cannot interpret something that is not there. The evidence wasn't ambiguous. It was absent. You were not interpreting intelligence. You were inventing a narrative. You were fabricating a story." "That is a lie," Schiff shot back, his voice cracking. "A slanderous lie." Kennedy reached into his binder and pulled out another document. This one bore the official seal of the United States House of Representatives. He held it up for the cameras to see. "House Resolution 521, Kennedy announced. "Dated June 21, 2023, this is the official record of the vote to censure you, Senator Schiff." The word censure hung in the air, an ugly, historical stain. In the gallery, Maria Gonzalez whispered the word to herself, as if trying to grasp its full meaning. "They censured him." Kennedy began to read from the resolution, his voice steady and clear. "Whereas Representative Adam Schiff misled the American people. Whereas Representative Schiff abused his access to sensitive information. Whereas Representative Schiff engaged in conduct that brought disrepute on the House of Representatives." He looked up, letting the formal condemnation settle over the room. The final vote was 213 to 209, And before you try to dismiss this as a purely partisan exercise, Kennedy continued, reaching for a stack of printed news articles, let's consider what your own Democratic colleagues said about you anonymously to reporters in the days after the vote. He began to read the quotes, one by one, each a small betrayal, a testament to the trust he had broken. He went out on a limb and then sawed it off behind him, taking the rest of us with him. Another, we put our political careers in his hands, and he repaid us by selling us a fantasy. And a third, his constant grandstanding made it impossible for the rest of us to be taken seriously. He poisoned the well for legitimate oversight. Schiff's face, which had cycled through red and white, now seemed to settle on a sickly, ashen gray. He looked like a man watching his own political obituary being read aloud. That was political retribution, he managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. It was revenge for my role in the impeachment. Retribution from your own party, Senator? Kennedy asked, his question a soft, sharp jab. You were officially condemned by the very body you served in for over 2 decades. You are one of only 25 members in the entire history of the United States to receive that formal rebuke. You claim it was political. Fine. Let's talk about the politics. Kennedy reached across the table and picked up a copy of the Steele dossier, holding it up by a corner as if it were a contaminated object. This document, the infamous Steele dossier, compiled by a former British spy, and paid for, as we now know with absolute certainty, by the Hillary Clinton campaign and the Democratic National Committee. He let that fact sink in. Paid for by your party, Senator. The political genesis of the entire affair. He opened the dossier to a marked page. Page 17. It alleges that the Trump campaign and Russia had a well-developed conspiracy of cooperation. Durham's conclusion? False. Never happened. Page 23. It claims Michael Cohen, Trump's lawyer, held secret meetings with Russian agents in Prague. Kennedy looked up. Robert Mueller's team, after an exhaustive investigation, proved that Mr. Cohen had never been to Prague in his life. He was in Los Angeles with his son. The alibi was ironclad. He turned another page. Page 36. The most salacious claim of compromising tapes and blackmail material. The conclusion of every single investigation. Not a shred of evidence has ever been found, anywhere, by anyone. Kennedy then pulled out another document. This one, a transcript. December of 2017, he said. A classified interview before the House Intelligence Committee, which you chaired. You, personally, were questioning the primary source for the Steele dossier, a man named Igor Danchenko. He looked directly at Schiff, his eyes cold. Under oath, Mr. Danchenko told you, and your committee, that much of his information was bar talk and hearsay. Those were his words, Senator. Bar talk. And yet, you went on television the very next month and told the American people the evidence was more than sufficient. Those transcripts were classified, Schiff protested, grasping at the procedural straw. You cannot discuss what was said in a classified setting. They were declassified last year, Senator. Kennedy replied calmly, shutting down the escape route. The American people have a right to know. They have a right to know what you knew, and when you knew it. For the first time, a flicker of genuine raw emotion entered Kennedy's voice. You had the truth in your hands in December of 2017. You knew the dossier was built on a foundation of rumor and gossip. You knew the source himself admitted it was unreliable. And you still went on television and sold it to the world as gospel. He set down the transcript and picked up a photograph, holding it up for the cameras. It showed a modern, unremarkable office building. This, he said, is the headquarters of One United Bank in Boston. We will get to that later. But first, let's talk about the real-world consequences of the story you were selling. The screen behind him changed, displaying a map of the United States. Suddenly, red dots began to pop up across the country. From California to Florida, from Texas to Maine. Families torn apart, Kennedy said. his voice dropping to a near whisper. Friendships of decades destroyed. Vicious arguments over Thanksgiving dinners. Death threats. Political violence. His voice grew stronger. All of it fueled by the narrative that the President of the United States was a secret agent of a foreign power. A narrative that you, as the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, with access to our nation's deepest secrets, knew was a lie. In the gallery, Maria Gonzalez closed her eyes, the tears she had been holding back finally beginning to fall. She remembered the bitter fights with her brother-in-law, who had called her son a pawn, dying for a traitor. The family had fractured, the wounds so deep they had not even spoken at the funeral. It was all based on a lie told by the man sitting right there. The number of empty seats in the gallery was now impossible to ignore. The room, once packed to the rafters, was now closer to 2/3 full. The defections were no longer quiet. They were a statement. Kennedy, however, was far from finished. "But spreading disinformation, as damaging as it was," he said, his tone shifting again, "is not the only thing we need to discuss today, Senator. That was a political sin, an ethical breach of the highest order. But what you did next?" He reached into his binder and pulled out a folder. This one a stark, ominous red, the color used to denote highly classified material. "What you did next," Kennedy said, his voice low and grave, "may very well have been a federal crime." The sight of the red folder sent a fresh wave of shock through the committee room. This was no longer about political spin or misrepresenting intelligence. The color alone signified a breach of national security. The remaining reporters leaned forward, their fingers poised over their keyboards, sensing the story was about to take a much darker turn. Schiff stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake, his hands trembling slightly where they rested on the table. Kennedy opened the folder and removed a single document, its header bearing the unmistakable seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. "This," he said, holding it up, "is an FBI Form 302, the official report of a witness interview. This particular 302 summarizes an interview with a career staffer, a Democrat, who served on the House Intelligence Committee for 10 years. 10 years, Senator. A man who worked directly for you." Schiff's face, already a pale mask, seemed to shrink. He knew which staffer Kennedy was talking about. A quiet, meticulous analyst who had been pushed out for what was euphemistically called a lack of team spirit. "This whistleblower," Kennedy continued, his voice steady and somber, "approached the FBI with grave concerns. He reported that in early 2017, you, personally, authorized the systematic leaking of classified information to preferred media outlets." "Lies!" Schiff's voice was a hoarse croak. "He's a disgruntled employee with an axe to grind." "Is he?" Kennedy countered, his calm unwavering. "The FBI found him credible, so credible, in fact, that they interviewed him on 3 separate occasions over 6 years. His story never changed. He provided names, dates, and corroborating evidence. He even named other staffers who could verify his account." The room was deathly quiet. The gravity of the accusation, a sitting chairman of the Intelligence Committee running a covert leak operation, was staggering. "The whistleblower told the FBI," Kennedy went on, his eyes locked on Schiff, "that you told your senior staff that the purpose of these leaks was, and I quote, to build a narrative and to ensure the media had the ammunition needed to indict President Trump." The chamber erupted. Shouts of "outrageous" and "prove it" came from the few remaining Schiff loyalists, while reporters yelled questions at the dais. Chairman Graham's gavel came down with a series of sharp, angry cracks. "Order! Order in this committee!" he boomed, his face flushed with anger. "One more outburst, and I will have the gallery cleared." The noise subsided, but the tension remained, thick and suffocating. Kennedy waited patiently for the room to settle, his composure a stark contrast to the chaos. When silence was restored, he continued as if he had never been interrupted. "The whistleblower described your actions to the FBI as, and this is his word, Treasonous. The word landed with the force of a physical blow. Treason. It was the most heinous crime in the American political lexicon. He alleged, Kennedy said, that you and a small circle of trusted aides created what he called a shadow press office, a clandestine operation designed to launder classified intelligence into front-page news stories. The projector screen behind Kennedy flickered to life again, this time displaying a flowchart. At the very top, a box read, Rep. Schiff, Authorize Leak. Arrows pointed downwards to a series of other boxes, outlining a chillingly methodical process. The FBI's investigation, based on the whistleblower's testimony, uncovered the mechanics of your operation, Kennedy explained, using his laser pointer to trace the flow of information. First, your staffers would attend classified briefings with the CIA, NSA, or DIA. They would take notes. Then they would return to a secure room in the committee's offices, a room containing a standalone computer, an air-gapped machine with no connection to the internet to prevent any electronic trail. The red dot moved to the next box. They would type up summaries of the classified material, stripping out just enough detail to provide plausible deniability, but leaving in the most damaging nuggets. These summaries were then brought to you, Senator, for final approval. The laser pointer followed the arrow to the next stage. Once you gave the green light, a designated staffer would contact a cutout, an intermediary, often a lobbyist or a political consultant, someone who could plausibly meet with a reporter without raising suspicion. This cutout would then meet the journalist, often at a coffee shop or a bar, and pass along the information as a deep background tip. The final box on the chart showed a list of news organizations. And then, like clockwork, Kennedy said, turning to face Schiff, a story would appear in the New York Times or the Washington Post or on CNN. And the very next day, you would go on television, look directly into the camera, and say with a straight face that you couldn't possibly comment on sensitive classified matters, all the while knowing that your own office was the source of the story. This is a fantasy, Schiff insisted, his voice strained. A paranoid conspiracy theory cooked up by my political enemies. You have no proof. We have the whistleblower's sworn testimony, Kennedy said quietly. We have the testimony of other staffers he named, who were subpoenaed by the FBI and confirmed his account. We have travel vouchers and expense reports showing your aides in the same cities, on the same days, as the reporters who broke the stories. We have text messages, obtained legally, discussing which journalists were friendly and reliable. He gestured toward the back of the room. And we have more. A man rose from his seat in the gallery. He was young, perhaps in his early 30s, with the earnest, slightly overwhelmed look of a former Hill staffer. His hands were visibly shaking as he held a folded piece of paper. I have something to say, he announced, his voice trembling but clear. Capitol police officers immediately started moving toward him, but Kennedy held up a hand, stopping them in their tracks. Let him speak, Mr. Chairman. Graham hesitated for a second, then gave a curt nod. State your name for the record. My name is David Chen, the man said. I was an intelligence analyst for the House Intelligence Committee under Chairman Schiff from 2016 until I was let go in 2018. A flicker of recognition, then panic, crossed Schiff's face. He's a liar! He was fired for cause! Get him out of here! Let the man finish, Senator, Graham commanded, his voice booming with authority. Chen took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on Schiff. I was there, he said, his voice growing stronger. I knew the staffer who went to the FBI. He was my friend. He told me what was happening. He told me about the pressure to leak, about the air-gapped computer. He told me he was being forced out because he questioned the legality of the operation, because he was told he lacked sufficient party loyalty. Those were the exact words used. The room was utterly silent, hanging on every word. I was young, Chen continued, his voice thick with shame. I was scared. I needed the job to pay off my student loans, so I kept my head down. I stayed quiet, but I saw it. I saw the summaries being written. I knew what was happening. He looked directly at Schiff, his former boss. And when the FBI contacted me 2 years ago, I told them everything. I corroborated every single word of my friend's testimony. It was all true, all of it. Chen sat down, his testimony complete. It was no longer an anonymous report or a political accusation. It was a human being, a former insider, publicly confirming the conspiracy. The impact was devastating. "Thank you, Mr. Chen," Kennedy said softly. He turned his attention back to the man at the witness table. "Senator Schiff, the penalties for the unauthorized disclosure of classified information under Title 18, Section 793 of the U.S. Code are severe, up to 10 years in federal prison, per count." He let that sink in. The FBI identified at least 5 separate major leaks originating from your committee during that period. That's 5 counts, potentially 50 years of prison time. He paused. The only reason the Department of Justice did not pursue an indictment was your congressional immunity, an immunity that protects you from prosecution, but does not protect you from the truth. It does not protect you from the judgment of this committee or from the judgment of the American people. He neatly stacked the papers related to the leak investigation and set them aside. You weaponized our nation's secrets for political gain. You corrupted a committee tasked with protecting this country. You silenced and smeared a man of conscience who tried to stop you. He looked up at Schiff, his expression one of cold contempt. "That is not oversight, Senator. That is not patriotism. That is a profound and despicable corruption of power." Schiff had collapsed back into his chair, his face buried in his hands. The man who had started the hearing with such arrogant fury was now a shrunken, defeated figure. But Kennedy wasn't finished. His voice shifted, becoming more personal, more intimate. "But this, as terrible as it is not just about political crimes. You also chose to enrich yourself at the expense of the very people you swore to serve." He reached for a new folder, this one a plain manila, but marked with a handwritten label that was visible even from the gallery. "Mortgage fraud." The movement was deliberate, signaling a new front in the assault. "This," Kennedy said, his voice dropping, "is about how you stole from them." The screen behind him changed, displaying 2 photographs side by side. One showed a sprawling, elegant brick home in a wealthy Maryland suburb. The other, a modest condominium in Burbank, California. "Let's talk about your houses, Senator," Kennedy said. "Let's talk about the lies you told to the banks. Let's talk about fraud." The atmosphere in the room shifted once again. The allegations of Russian collusion and classified leaks, while monumental, were complex and somewhat abstract for the average citizen. But mortgage fraud, that was different. It was personal, tangible, and deeply resonant in a country where home ownership is a cornerstone of the American dream. And the memory of the 2008 financial crisis still lingered. The images on the screen told a stark story. On the left, the Maryland house, a stately, multi-story brick home surrounded by manicured lawns and a swimming pool shimmering in the sun. On the right, the California condo, a functional but unremarkable unit in a standard suburban complex. Below the images, text appeared, "Potomac, Maryland, 3420 Schiff, 4 bedrooms, pool. Current value, $1.4 million, and next to it, Burbank, California, 650 Schiff, 1 bedroom. Current value, $450,000. Then, a final damning line appeared below both. Both claimed as primary residence on sworn legal documents, 2009 to 2020. "It's called mortgage fraud, Senator," Kennedy said, his voice devoid of its earlier softness, now carrying a hard prosecutorial edge. He pulled a new document from the folder, this one bearing the letterhead of Fannie Mae, the government-sponsored mortgage giant. "In 2003, he began, "you purchased this beautiful home in Potomac, Maryland, for $870,000. To do so, You secured a mortgage for $610,000, a loan backed by the American taxpayer. And on your official sworn mortgage application, you signed an affidavit. He held the document up, and a close-up of Schiff's looping signature appeared on the screen. You declared, under penalty of perjury, that this Maryland property would be your primary and principal residence. He set the paper down and picked up another. Then, 6 years later, in 2009, you purchased this condominium in your congressional district in Burbank, California. You financed this purchase as well. And on this mortgage application, Kennedy held up the second document, another of Schiff's signatures flashing on the screen. You also declared it to be your primary residence. COD. This second declaration, this lie, allowed you to qualify for a preferential interest rate and to claim a California homeowner's tax exemption, a benefit reserved for a citizen's one and only primary home, an exemption that saved you, personally, about $7,000 a year, every year, for over a decade. The math was simple, the deception blatant. A low murmur rippled through the gallery. This wasn't about complex intelligence. This was about cheating on your taxes and lying to the bank, something everyone understood. Now, Senator, Kennedy said, leaning forward, I may not be a fancy Harvard-educated lawyer like you. I'm just a country lawyer from Louisiana. But even I understand that a person can only have one primary home. Federal law, banking regulations, and basic common sense are all very clear on this point. He held up a printout of federal mortgage guidelines. A primary residence is defined as the place where you truly live, your fixed and permanent home, the place you intend to return to. It is not a second home. It is not a vacation home. It is not an investment property. You get one, not two. I am required to maintain residences in both Washington and my district, Schiff protested, his voice weak, the argument sounding hollow even to his own ears. It is a requirement of my job. Every member of Congress does. And every member of Congress is required to be honest, Kennedy shot back, his voice sharp. Yes, members have two homes. They designate one as primary and one as secondary. The financing is different. The interest rates are different. The tax implications are different. Because knowingly claiming a secondary property as your primary residence to get better financial terms is fraud. It is stealing from the bank that issued the loan. It is stealing from the taxpayers who back that loan. And it is stealing from every honest American who tells the truth on their application and pays the higher rate. Kennedy paused, and for the first time in the hearing, his professional prosecutorial demeanor seemed to crack. He took off his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose, a deep, weary sigh escaping his lips. He pulled the handkerchief from his pocket again, but this time it was not for a calculated, dramatic effect. His hand trembled slightly as he dabbed at the corner of his eye. The room fell silent, sensing a shift from a political attack to something deeply personal. My mother, Kennedy began, his voice thick with an emotion he seemed to struggle to control, lost her house in the 2008 crash. The confession was unexpected, raw, and utterly captivating. The bank had pushed her into a subprime loan she never should have qualified for. But when the market collapsed, when she fell behind, when she begged them for a modification, for a little forbearance, for a little grace, they said no. He paused, composing himself, the memory clearly still painful. She was 67 years old. She took on a second job, then a third, cleaning houses, trying to scrape together enough to save her home, the only home she'd ever known. He looked up, his eyes glistening under the bright lights. She lost it anyway. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by a single soft sob from the gallery. And you know what, Senator? Kennedy continued, his voice a low, trembling whisper. My mother had one home. She told the truth on every single form she ever filled out in her life. She played by the rules, her entire life. She believed in the system. He then looked directly at Adam Schiff, and the quiet grief in his eyes transformed into a cold, righteous fury. And while my mother was working 3 jobs at 67 years old, scrubbing other people's floors to try to save her home, you were refinancing your $1.4 million mansion in Maryland, a property you were falsely claiming as your primary residence, lying under oath to get a lower interest rate, a better deal that you were not entitled to. The human contrast was devastating. It was no longer about a politician versus a politician. It was about a powerful man who cheated the system versus an elderly woman who was crushed by it. Kennedy put his glasses back on. His composure regained, but his demeanor had changed. The fight was now personal. Between 2009 and 2020, he continued, his voice like cold steel, a period of 11 years, you refinanced that Maryland property 4 separate times. In 2009, 2011, 2012, and again in 2013. And on each and every one of those occasions, you signed a legally binding affidavit, under penalty of perjury, declaring that mansion to be your one and only primary residence. Each time, that was a lie. And each time, you received more favorable terms than an honest citizen would have received. He pulled another letter from the folder. This is a criminal referral from William Pye, the director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, the agency that oversees Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. It is addressed to the Attorney General, and it is dated May of this year. He began to read from the letter. Our review indicates that Mr. Adam B. Schiff has, in multiple instances, falsified official bank documents and property records to acquire more favorable loan terms. This conduct appears to have violated multiple federal criminal statutes, including wire fraud, mail fraud, bank fraud, and making false statements to a financial institution under Title 18, Section 1014 of the U.S. Code. This is a political witch hunt, Schiff exclaimed, grasping at the only defense he had left. Pye is a Trump appointee, an appointee that you yourself voted to confirm, Senator. Kennedy interrupted smoothly. The Senate confirmed Director Pye with a broad, bipartisan majority. Your name is on the list of yay votes. Did you think he was a partisan hack then, when you voted to give him the job? Schiff had no answer. He slumped in his chair, defeated. The intricate web of his own lies was becoming a cage. Kennedy pressed his advantage, the methodical prosecutor zeroing in for the kill. He pulled out 2 more documents, holding them up side by side. Here is your official 2023 campaign website, Senator. Under the About Adam section, it proudly states, "My primary residence has always been and will always be in Burbank, California, where I live with my family." A clear, unequivocal statement to your voters. He then gestured to the other document. And here is your 2011 mortgage refinancing affidavit for your Maryland mansion. It contains the sworn statement, "This property is my primary residence." Both are official statements. Both are sworn oaths. They are mutually exclusive. One of them must be a lie. He looked directly at Schiff, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Which oath did you violate, Senator? The one you made to the American people, or the one you made to the bank? Schiff stared back, his mouth agape, a man trapped in a paradox of his own creation. He had no answer. The silence stretched, thick and damning. "Let's talk about the money," Kennedy said, his tone shifting to that of a forensic accountant. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, old-fashioned pocket calculator, holding it up for the cameras to see. The simple, almost quaint object was a brilliant piece of political theater. Primary residence mortgage rates are, on average, about half a percentage point to a full percentage point lower than rates for secondary homes. On loans of the size you were carrying over a period of 16 years, with multiple refinancings, he began to press the buttons, the soft clicks audible in the hushed room. That fraudulent declaration saved you somewhere between $30,000 and $50,000 in interest payments, money that should have gone to the bank, and by extension, to the taxpayers who back these loans. He continued clicking. Then, Let's add the California homeowner's tax exemption you claimed, a benefit you were not legally entitled to since your primary home was, by your own sworn statement to the bank, in Maryland. That's approximately $7,000 per year. Over 11 years. He pressed the equals button with a final definitive click. That's another $77,000. All told, Senator, your lies put more than $100,000 into your pocket. You didn't earn it. You stole it. You stole it from the system, from the taxpayers, and from every honest person who plays by the rules. As he finished his calculation, a woman stood up in the gallery. She was middle-aged, dressed in the simple, professional attire of a teacher. Her face was tear-streaked, and she was clutching a letter in her hand. "My name is Jennifer Martinez," she said, her voice trembling but filled with a righteous anger. "In 2012, I was a single mother, a public school teacher making $45,000 a year. I applied for a mortgage to buy a small townhouse so my son could have a backyard." She held up the crumpled letter. "I was denied. The bank said my debt-to-income ratio was too high. It was the same bank, Senator Schiff, that you used to refinance your mansion that very same year." Her voice broke, but she pushed on. "You were a millionaire. You had a guaranteed congressional salary of $174,000, plus book deals and speaking fees. You got your loan approved by lying. I was denied my loan by telling the truth." She looked from Schiff to Kennedy, her eyes pleading. "Where is the justice in that? Where is the fairness?" She sat down, her shoulders shaking with sobs. The gallery was silent, the emotional weight of her testimony far more powerful than any political rhetoric. Kennedy let the moment hang in the air, allowing the injustice of it to sink in. He gave the woman a solemn nod of acknowledgement. "That," he said quietly, turning his gaze back to Schiff, "is the real crime here, Senator. It's not just the $100,000 you pocketed, though that is theft, plain and simple. The real crime is the corrosion of trust. It's the honest people like Ms. Martinez who are punished for their integrity, while the powerful and connected, like you, are rewarded for their deceit. You broke the faith." Schiff, seeing a potential lifeline, suddenly looked up. You mentioned Ken Paxton," he stammered, referencing the Texas Attorney General who had faced similar accusations. "He claimed multiple primary residences. Where was your outrage then? Where was the Republican outrage?" He looked around, a desperate hope in his eyes that he could escape by pointing to another's alleged sin. Kennedy looked at him with something approaching pity. "He is under investigation by the authorities in Texas, Senator," he said calmly, "and if the evidence shows he broke the law, he should be prosecuted to the fullest extent. No one should be above the law. But I find it interesting, your choice of defense. You are not saying, 'I am innocent.' You are not saying, 'I did not do this.' You are saying, 'But he did it too.'" Kennedy leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential tone, as if sharing a secret with the entire room. "That is not a defense, Senator. That is a confession." The simple truth of the statement seemed to suck the remaining air from Schiff's lungs. He visibly deflated, slumping further in his chair. His last gambit had failed, turned back on him as an admission of guilt. "And there is one more thing," Kennedy said, adding another layer to the indictment. "The law is very clear. As a member of Congress, you are required to disclose all personal liabilities over $10,000 on your annual financial disclosure forms. It's about transparency. It's about letting the public know who you owe money to." He pulled out a new stack of papers. "You purchased the Maryland home in 2003. You did not disclose the mortgage on that property to the public until 2011. That is 8 years of hiding a major financial liability. You purchased the California condo in 2009. You didn't disclose that mortgage until 2011 either, 2 years late. You were, in fact, fined $5,000 by the House Ethics Committee in 2012 for these late disclosures, so you cannot claim ignorance. You knew the rules. You simply chose to ignore them. Kennedy began to gather the papers from the mortgage fraud section, stacking them into a neat pile. He had built his case, brick by brick, lie by lie. "So, let's summarize," he said, his voice cold and clinical. "We have a 3-year campaign of deliberate disinformation about Russian collusion. We have a systematic criminal operation to leak classified intelligence for political gain. We have a decades-long scheme of mortgage fraud to enrich yourself. And we have a consistent pattern of hiding your financial dealings from the public you were elected to serve." He paused, then reached for the final and thickest folder on the table. It was at least 4 inches thick, bound in black, with a series of colored tabs sticking out from the side. "But all of this," Kennedy said, his voice low and ominous as he placed the massive binder on the table with a heavy thud, "is just part of a much larger picture. This folder shows the complete pattern of your career. It shows that your entire tenure in public service has been marked by a toxic combination of corruption, deception, and a belief that you are above the very laws you help write." He opened the folder, revealing tabs that read, "Censure, Ethics Violations, Media Deception, Campaign Finance, and Investigation." "But let's talk about your legacy, Senator Schiff," Kennedy said, as 4 large screens surrounding the witness table flickered to life, trapping Schiff in a digital prison of his own making. Adam Schiff was trapped. 4 giant screens now formed a digital cage around him, each one a monument to his downfall. He turned his head, but there was no escape. To his left, a screen blared. "Censured by U.S. House of Representatives, June 2023. To his right, blocked from House Intelligence Committee, January 2023. In front of him, another screen read, "Multiple Ethics Investigations, Ongoing." And behind him, a 4th screen displayed the most terrifying message of all, "OJ Criminal Referral, May 2025. He was surrounded, not by walls of stone, but by the documented consequences of his own actions. Kennedy remained standing, his posture unchanged, his voice a relentless torrent of facts. "House Resolution 521, he began, gesturing to the first screen. "The official censure. Let me read the key findings into the record one more time, so that there is no ambiguity." He read slowly, his voice resonating with the formal language of the resolution, giving each charge its full, solemn weight. Whereas Representative Adam Schiff repeatedly and knowingly misled the American people regarding allegations of collusion between the Trump campaign and the government of Russia. Whereas Representative Schiff abused his position of extreme trust as chairman of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, weaponizing his access to classified information for partisan political purposes. Whereas Representative Schiff's conduct has brought dishonor and disrepute upon the House of Representatives. He looked up from the document, his eyes boring into Schiff. "You are now a permanent part of a very small, very shameful club, Senator. Only the 25th member of the House to be formally censured in the entire history of our nation. At the time, you dismissed it. You called it a badge of honor. You claimed it was nothing more than political theater by your opponents." Kennedy paused, letting the question hang in the charged air. "Are you still proud of that badge, Senator? Does this still feel like theater to you?" The screen behind him changed, showing the vote tally. 213 to 209. "Every single Republican voted to condemn your actions," Kennedy continued, "but that was to be expected. What was not expected were the voices from your own side of the aisle." He picked up the stack of newspaper articles again. "After the vote, when the cameras were off, your Democratic colleagues, the people who served with you, who trusted you, began to speak to reporters anonymously. They were afraid to cross you in public, but they wanted the truth to be known." He read their words, each quote a dagger from a former ally. "He made us all look like fools," one senior Democrat told the Post. "He went on television day after day with these grand pronouncements, and we defended him, believing he had the evidence. He never did. Another, a fellow committee member, said, "We handed him our credibility on a silver platter, and he set it on fire just to see himself glow on TV." A third quote from a longtime colleague. His obsession with Trump didn't just damage his own reputation, it damaged the party's ability to conduct serious oversight for a generation. "No one will trust us now." Kennedy set the articles down. "These were not your enemies, Senator. These were your friends, your allies, your party. The Durham report proved you lied about the evidence. The FBI whistleblower proved you orchestrated a criminal leak operation. The Federal Housing Finance Agency proved you committed mortgage fraud. And yet, you want this committee, and the American people, to believe that your censure was just a partisan game." Before Schiff could muster a response, a figure rose slowly from the gallery. He was an elderly African-American man, leaning heavily on a dark, hand-carved wooden cane. His suit jacket was adorned with pins commemorating the 1965 Selma to Montgomery March and the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Faint, silvery scars, remnants of a violent past, were visible on his forearms. "I have something I must say," the man announced, his voice raspy with age, but imbued with an undeniable moral authority that instantly commanded the room's attention. Security officers, tensed for another disruption, looked to the dais. Kennedy simply raised a hand. "Please, sir," he said, his voice filled with genuine respect. "The committee would be honored to hear from you." Chairman Graham nodded his assent. "Please state your name for the record." "My name is James Wright," the man said, his voice growing stronger. "On March 7, 1965, a day they now call Bloody Sunday, I marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, alongside a young John Lewis. I was beaten by state troopers with billy clubs. I was attacked by police dogs." He gestured to the scars on his arms. "I spent 12 days in a hospital and 6 months in a county jail. I, and thousands like me, bled on that bridge so that men like you—" He pointed his cane directly at Adam Schiff, the tip quivering with emotion, "could have opportunities my generation could only dream of, so you could hold positions of power and trust." The room was utterly silent. The political drama had been silenced by the arrival of history itself. Every person in the room, from the senators on the dais to the reporters in the press box, was captivated. "You have dishonored everything we fought for," Mr. Wright continued, his voice ringing with the power of a prophet. "You took the FBI, the very same agency that illegally spied on Dr. King, that tried to blackmail him into suicide, that worked to destroy the civil rights movement, and you corrupted it all over again. You turned it into your own personal political weapon." Tears were now streaming down the old man's weathered face, but his voice did not falter. "You lied to the American people day after day, while wrapping yourself in the flag of justice. You stole from the taxpayers while pretending to be a champion for the little guy. You used the legacy of our struggle, the moral authority we bled for, as a shield to hide your own crimes." He struck the floor with the base of his cane. The sharp, resonant thump echoed through the chamber like a judge's gavel. Thump. "Shame on you, Senator Schiff." Thump. "Shame on you, and shame on the system that allowed you to flourish." James Wright turned, without waiting for a response, and began to walk slowly toward the exit. The only sound in the vast, silent room was the rhythmic tap-tap-tapping of his cane on the marble floor. Tap, tap, tap. It was the sound of a moral reckoning. It was the sound of a debt being called in. Even the most hardened political operatives on both sides were visibly moved. Several Democratic staffers were openly weeping. Adam Schiff himself had a single tear tracing a path down his cheek, the first genuine emotion he had shown all day. When the door finally closed behind Mr. Wright, Kennedy allowed the profound silence to linger for a long moment, a tribute to the gravity of what had just occurred. Finally, he turned back to his presentation, his voice softer now, imbued with the somber weight of the preceding testimony. "The media," he said simply, as a new screen lit up with a dizzying array of statistics and logos. "Let's talk about your accomplices." The new screen glowed with the familiar logos of America's most powerful news organizations: CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post. Below them, the numbers told a story of complicity. "During the 3 years of the Russia investigation," Kennedy began, his voice taking on the tone of a media critic, "CNN alone gave you 51 separate appearances to push your narrative. MSNBC gave you 47. The major broadcast networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, collectively hosted you 38 times. That is a total of 136 appearances on major networks, where you claimed, again and again, to have seen definitive evidence of collusion." A montage of clips began to play, but this time the focus was not on Schiff, but on the hosts. Jake Tapper, nodding sympathetically. Rachel Maddow, looking on with admiration as Schiff spoke of the damning evidence. Chuck Todd, offering no pushback, no skeptical follow-up questions. It was a montage of journalistic failure, a highlight reel of deference. "They never asked to see the evidence," Kennedy narrated, his voice laced with contempt. "They never questioned why the proof you claim to have seen never materialized. They didn't treat you as a source to be vetted. They treated you as a hero, a prophet. They made you a star, built your brand, and sold your story to the American people because it was good for ratings. Your lies were their business model." The screen changed, showing headlines from the days after the Durham report was released. The stories were there, but they were buried on page A17, relegated to the bottom of the homepage, framed as a partisan document. "And when the truth finally came out," Kennedy said, "when the Durham report proved you had lied, when the House voted to censure you, when the FBI whistleblower's testimony became public, they barely covered it. They looked away. Because to admit you were a fraud would be to admit that they were your willing accomplices. They had invested their own credibility in your lies, and they could not afford to write off that investment." Kennedy's voice took on a passionate edge. "A free and adversarial press is the immune system of a democracy. But when the press abandons skepticism for access, when it chooses narrative over truth, it becomes part of the disease. They didn't just fail to hold you accountable, Senator. They enabled you. They amplified your deception. And, in doing so, they betrayed their sacred calling just as surely as you betrayed your oath of office." He set down the media analysis and looked at Schiff, his expression grim. "But I want to be very clear, Senator, about what is happening at this very moment, as we sit in this room. This is no longer just a political reckoning or a media critique." He paused, letting the weight of his next words gather. "There are, as we speak, 2 federal grand juries actively empaneled and hearing testimony. One, in the state of Maryland, is examining the evidence of bank and mortgage fraud. The other, in the Eastern District of Virginia, is hearing evidence related to the criminal disclosure of classified information, specifically potential charges that may not be protected by your congressional immunity." Schiff's face went from ashen gray to a ghostly white. This was no longer theoretical. This was real. Grand juries, subpoenas, indictments. Attorney General Pam Bondi has appointed a special counsel, Mr. Ed Martin, to oversee both investigations, Kennedy continued, his voice a steady, dispassionate drumbeat of doom. "Mr. Martin met with FHFA Director Pai 3 days ago. Witnesses are being subpoenaed as we speak. Your former staffers are being compelled to testify under oath. Your bank records, your phone records, your travel logs, they have all been obtained. This is not speculation, Senator. This is not a political threat." He looked Schiff directly in the eye. "This is prosecution. The only question left is not if you will be indicted, but on how many counts." A timeline appeared on the screen, stark and terrifying. Criminal referrals, May 2025. Grand juries impaneled August 2025. Witness testimony, September 2025. Expected indictments, October, November 2025. There is a phrase, Kennedy said quietly. Justice delayed is not justice denied. It is coming for you, Senator. Kennedy's voice softened, and he once again removed his glasses, wiping his eyes. The anger was gone, replaced by a profound and heavy sadness. You asked me at the beginning of this hearing why this was so personal to me. I told you about my mother, and that was true, but it is more than that. He reached into his binder and pulled out one last item. It was not a document. It was a photograph, a formal military portrait. He held it up. In the front row of the gallery, a sharp, strangled gasp was heard. It was Maria Gonzalez. She had recognized the face instantly. It was her son. This, Kennedy said, his voice thick with emotion, is United States Marine Corps Lieutenant Marcus Gonzalez. He was killed in action in Afghanistan in October of 2018. The room was utterly still. His unit was on a reconnaissance mission in a highly contested area of Helmand Province. Their position was compromised. They were ambushed by a numerically superior Taliban force. Lieutenant Gonzalez and 4 other American Marines died in the firefight that followed. Kennedy's voice was now trembling with a grief that felt both personal and national. A subsequent investigation by the Defense Intelligence Agency traced the intelligence breach that led to that ambush. The leak did not come from the Pentagon. It did not come from the CIA. It originated here, on Capitol Hill, from the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. He let the horrific implication hang in the air. The time frame of the leak corresponds exactly with the period during which your systematic leak operation was in full swing. We cannot know for certain, not with 100% certainty, if it was one of your leaks, one of your staff's deep background tips to a reporter that got these men killed. But the possibility is there. The connection is there. He turned his gaze from Schiff to the front row, to the grieving mother clutching the photo of her son. His mother, Mrs. Maria Gonzalez, who sits here today, wrote to my office 3 times. 3 handwritten letters. She did not want vengeance. She just wanted to know why her son died. She wanted accountability. She wanted to know that his sacrifice was not in vain, that it was not squandered by the petty political games of powerful men in Washington. Kennedy turned back to Schiff, his eyes blazing with a fire that seemed to burn away everything else. That is why I am here, Senator. That is why this is personal. Not for politics, not for revenge. I am here for Maria Gonzalez. I am here for her son, Marcus. I am here for every American you lied to, every institution you corrupted, and every person who was harmed by your insatiable hunger for power. The room was a wreck. There was not a dry eye in the House. Republicans, Democrats, staffers, reporters, everyone was united in a shared moment of profound tragedy and sorrow. Even Adam Schiff, the architect of his own destruction, was now weeping openly, his head in his hands, his body shaking with uncontrollable sobs. Kennedy gathered his papers, his movements slow and deliberate, a final act of order in the midst of emotional chaos. I am finished, Mr. Chairman, he said quietly. He buttoned his suit jacket and turned to leave. Wait! Schiff's head shot up, his face a mess of tears and desperation. Kennedy, wait, please. I can explain. Kennedy paused at the exit, his back still to Schiff. He did not turn around. He spoke to the door, but his words were meant for the broken man at the table. Explain it to the grand jury, Senator, he said, his voice cold and final. Explain it to Maria Gonzalez. He opened the door. Explain it to Marcus. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Adam Schiff utterly and completely alone in the ruins of his life. Chairman Graham's gavel came down, but the sound was muffled, absorbed by the heavy, grief-stricken silence in the room. This hearing is adjourned, he announced, his voice hoarse. The words seemed inadequate, a procedural footnote to a human catastrophe. The room began to empty. Not with the usual post-hearing buzz of chatter and speculation, but with the somber, shuffling quiet of mourners leaving a graveside service. Democrats, who had entered the room that morning with swagger and confidence, now fled, their faces averted, refusing to make eye contact with the reporters who lined their path. Republicans, for their part, offered no triumphant sound bites. They left quietly, their expressions grim, as if they too understood that what they had just witnessed transcended partisan victory. It was a public execution, and no one felt like celebrating. At the witness table, Adam Schiff remained frozen, a solitary figure in a sea of empty chairs. He was a statue of ruin. The cameras, still rolling, zoomed in on his face, capturing the vacant stare, the tear tracks on his cheeks, the spittle that had dried at the corner of his mouth. He tried to stand, but his legs refused to obey. The combination of 9 hours of relentless pressure, profound humiliation, and the crushing weight of his future had short-circuited his body. "Senator," his chief of staff whispered, rushing to his side, his face pale with panic. "Senator, we have to go. We need to get you out of here." "I can't," Schiff whispered, the words catching in his throat. "My legs. I can't stand up." The aide, a young man who had built his entire career around Schiff's rising star, looked around helplessly before signaling to 2 Capitol police officers standing near the door. They approached with a professional reluctance, each taking one of Schiff's arms. They lifted him to his feet, his body limp, his weight a dead thing between them. The few photographers who had remained captured the devastating image. The once powerful chairman, the feared prosecutor of a president, being half carried from the room like a common drunk, his face a mask of utter desolation. His phone, left behind on the table, lit up with a relentless cascade of notifications. 147 missed calls. Texts scrolled across the screen too quickly to read. A digital torrent of abandonment. "Can't talk now." "No comment." "I'm sorry, Adam." "You're on your own." The hallway outside was a chaotic gauntlet of flashing cameras and shouted questions. The press, subdued just moments before, had reverted to its predatory nature. "Senator, will you resign? Did you commit mortgage fraud? Did your leaks get a Marine killed? Will you plead guilty to save your family from a trial?" Schiff stumbled forward, his eyes fixed on the floor, the questions washing over him like a filthy tide. His aide, running interference, pushed microphones away, repeating a frantic mantra. "No comment. The senator has no comment at this time." They reached the grand steps of the Capitol, but the ordeal was not over. A crowd had gathered, a strange and volatile mix of MAGA hats and progressive T-shirts, 2 warring tribes brought together by a common object of scorn. The signs they held were brutal and direct. "Liar. Justice for Marcus. Lock him up. You betrayed us." A woman with a "Persist" sticker on her jacket broke through the police line, her face contorted with rage. "I knocked on doors for you," she screamed, her voice cracking with betrayal. "I gave you my money. You lied to us all." Schiff flinched, as if struck. He looked for his official car, his driver, his familiar escape route. It wasn't there. A text had come through minutes earlier. "Vehicle has been recalled, sir. Terribly sorry." Even the drivers were severing ties. A sitting United States Senator, a man who flew on Air Force Two and had the ear of the Speaker of the House, was stranded on a curb, forced to pull out his personal phone and call an Uber. The 5-minute wait felt like an eternity. He stood there, a man in a bespoke suit, surrounded by a cordon of police, as a mob of his own constituents and enemies screamed at him. When the black sedan finally pulled up, the driver, a young man with an earpiece, did a double-take. "Whoa," he said. "You're that guy. The guy from the news." Schiff said nothing, collapsing into the back seat, pulling the door shut as if to block out the world. As the car pulled away, rain began to fall, streaking the windows, blurring the faces of the angry crowd. Every television in every bar and restaurant they passed was tuned to the news, and his face was on every screen. He couldn't escape himself. The car radio was on, playing clips from the hearing. He heard his own voice from that morning, arrogant and full of contempt. "You're nothing but a cheap fraud in a rumpled suit." Then came Kennedy's calm, steady reply, followed by the devastating testimony of James Wright and the tearful plea of Jennifer Martinez. The driver kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror, a look of morbid curiosity on his face. Meanwhile, miles away, in his quiet Senate office, John Kennedy sat alone. His jacket was off, his tie was loosened, and the immense exhaustion of the day was etched onto his face. His own phone was ringing incessantly with calls from Fox News, CNN, and every major paper. He ignored them all. This had never been about a victory lap. On his desk, he had placed the 3 handwritten letters from Maria Gonzalez. Next to them was a faded photograph of his own mother, a woman who had played by the rules and lost everything. He stared at them for a long time, the 2 sources of his resolve. Had he done the right thing? Or had he just unleashed a different kind of poison into the body politic? He opened a drawer and took out the small, wallet-sized photo of Marcus Gonzalez that Maria had pressed into his hand after the hearing, her hand trembling, her eyes full of a grief that would never end. "Thank you," she had whispered. "Thank you for saying his name." He picked up his phone and made a single call. "Mrs. Gonzalez," he said softly. "It's John Kennedy." He could hear her weeping on the other end of the line, a complex sound of sorrow and relief. "Today," he said, his own voice thick with emotion, "your son was honored. His service, his sacrifice, it mattered, and someone is finally being held accountable." They spoke for 10 minutes, not as a senator and a constituent, but as 2 people bound by a shared sense of loss and a fragile hope for justice. When he hung up, he did not feel triumphant. He felt a quiet, somber sense of duty fulfilled. Then he opened another drawer in his desk. It was filled with other files, other binders, other cases of corruption, waste, and abuse of power. The work was never done. This was just one battle. The war for the soul of the country, he knew, was long, and it was far from over. 1 week later, the fallout for Adam Schiff was no longer a storm. It was a permanent, toxic climate. He was a prisoner in his own multi-million-dollar California home, a house that was itself a monument to his lies. The protesters had finally dispersed, their anger moving on to the next 24-hour news cycle, but their departure offered no relief. It only deepened the silence. The professional destruction had been swift and total. The Senate Democratic Caucus, in a terse press release, announced that his committee assignments were under review pending the outcome of federal investigations. A polite, public shunning that everyone understood meant he was being stripped of all power and influence. His political career was over. 3 of his most senior staffers had resigned within 48 hours, their carefully worded statements expressing gratitude for the opportunity to have served, while making it clear they were jumping from a sinking ship. 4 others had scrubbed any mention of his name from their social media profiles and were desperately networking, trying to escape the stain of his brand. One, his former press secretary, had already given a tell-all interview to a political magazine, carefully detailing his own growing unease over the chairman's methods. Campaign donors, the lifeblood of any political operation, were not just closing their checkbooks. They were demanding refunds, threatening lawsuits to claw back contributions they now considered tainted. His once formidable email list was hemorrhaging thousands of unsubscribers an hour. His publisher had invoked the morals clause in his book contract, canceling a 7-figure deal for his forthcoming memoir, which was to have been titled Truth to Power. The irony was crushing, but the professional ruin, as complete as it was, paled in comparison to the legal vice that was tightening around him. His days were a monotonous blur of frantic meetings with a team of astronomically expensive defense lawyers. They spoke in hushed, grim tones about asset forfeiture, sentencing guidelines, and the pros and cons of a plea bargain. Resign now and beg for leniency? Or fight the charges and risk dying in prison? Every option was a different shade of hell. The evidence, they admitted, was overwhelming. The paper trail from the mortgage fraud was undeniable. The testimony from his former staffers in the leak investigation was damning. And the emotional weight of the Marcus Gonzalez story had made him the most reviled man in America, ensuring that no jury would ever view him with sympathy. Personally, the toll was even worse. His wife, who had stood by him through decades of political battles, now looked at him with a stranger's eyes. The silence in the house was a living thing, broken only by clipped, functional exchanges. They slept in separate wings of the house, two isolated islands of misery. His children, both adults, called with a pained, dutiful infrequency, their conversations strained and full of unspoken accusations. Friends he had known since law school, men who had been groomsmen at his wedding, no longer returned his calls. He had lost 12 pounds in 7 days, his expensive suits hanging loosely on his shrunken frame. He couldn't eat. He couldn't sleep. When exhaustion finally claimed him, his dreams were haunted by the echoing tap of James Wright's cane and the cold, dead eyes of the prosecutor in his nightmares. His doctor had prescribed a heavy dose of anti-anxiety medication, which only wrapped his despair in a thick chemical fog. He spent his days in his home office, the television on but the sound muted, watching the cable news channels play endless loops of his own public execution. He saw the man he had been just 1 week ago, so full of confidence and righteous fury, and he felt nothing. It was like watching a stranger. His laptop was open to a news aggregator, the headlines a relentless chorus of his demise. Schiff's legacy in tatters. How one senator's hubris destroyed a career. California Democrats scramble to distance themselves from embattled colleague. Grand juries moving swiftly. Indictments expected within weeks. His phone, which had once been his conduit to power, now sat silent on his desk for hours at a time. The powerful people who had once courted his favor had moved on. The governor of California, who used to golf with him, had issued a one-sentence statement. These are serious and disturbing allegations that must be fully investigated. The Speaker of the House, who had once entrusted him to lead an impeachment, told a reporter, "Adam needs to take a long look in the mirror and decide what is best for the country and the party." The translation was clear: resign and disappear. At 65 years old, a United States Senator for less than 2 years, his life's work had turned to ash. His legacy would not be the statesman who held a president accountable, but the corrupt charlatan who was exposed in the most public and humiliating way imaginable. His freedom was no longer a certainty. He sat there in the gathering darkness, the only light in the room coming from the muted television screen, which showed John Kennedy's face, calm and resolute. He finally understood. The cheap glasses, the rumpled suit, the slow country drawl, it had all been a mask. He had picked a fight with a man he fundamentally misunderstood, a man who didn't play the game of sound bites and partisan rage. He had mistaken quiet for weakness and politeness for cowardice. He had charged headfirst at a man who had simply waited, patiently, for his opponent's own momentum to become the instrument of his destruction. The reckoning had come, and it was absolute. Outside his window, the street was quiet. The world had moved on. He was yesterday's villain, a cautionary tale waiting for its final chapter to be written by a federal prosecutor. Adam Schiff, the man who had called John Kennedy a cheap fraud, finally understood what Kennedy had known all along. Sometimes, the quietest men are the most dangerous. Sometimes, the most devastating weapon is not a shout, but a fact. And sometimes, the price of destroying others is, in the end, your own soul. The fight for truth is a brutal one, and the casualties are real. If you believe that accountability is not a partisan issue, and that no one should be above the law, Then smash that like button, subscribe to this channel for more deep dives into the corridors of power, and stay until the very end of every video to see how these shocking showdowns unfold.